Eddie sat at the high-stakes poker table, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his cards. The casino buzzed with activity around him, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The stakes had never been higher, and tonight, it wasn't just his money on the line. He glanced at the neatly stacked chips in front of him, the bright colors representing more than he could afford to lose. The other players at the table eyed him, each with their own confident smirks. They were seasoned veterans of the game, men who had made and lost fortunes on nights like this. Eddie knew their type well. He'd been one of them for years, riding the waves of luck and misfortune. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just gambling with his own money. "Call," he said, pushing a towering stack of chips into the center of the table. His voice was steady, betraying none of the fear gnawing at his insides. He'd already committed too much to back out now. The pot was enormous, more than he'd ever seen in his life. The other players followed suit, adding their own chips to the pot until it was overflowing. Eddie's mind flashed back to earlier that evening. He'd been at the bar, nursing a whiskey, when the man had approached him. A stranger, dressed in an expensive suit, with a calm confidence that immediately put Eddie on edge. "Eddie Blake, right?" the man had said, sliding onto the stool next to him. Eddie had nodded, wary but curious. The man introduced himself as Victor, no last name, no other details. He'd offered Eddie a drink, which he accepted, and after a few minutes of small talk, the real conversation began. "I've got a proposition for you," Victor had said, leaning in close. "I know you're good at cards, one of the best. And I've got $500,000 that says you can win tonight's game." Eddie had almost choked on his drink. $500,000. It was an obscene amount of money, the kind that could solve all his problems in one night. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. "What's the deal?" Eddie had asked, trying to sound casual. Victor had smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Eddie's spine. "It's simple. You take my money, you play, and you win. We split the profits, 50-50. But if you lose, well, let's just say it wouldn't be in your best interest to lose." Eddie had known it was a bad idea from the start. But the promise of that kind of money, the thought of finally digging himself out of the hole he'd spent years in, was too tempting to resist. He'd agreed, against his better judgment, and now here he was, sitting at the table with everything on the line. The dealer flipped the final card, and Eddie's heart skipped a beat. The river was a king, a card that could either make or break him. He glanced at his hand, trying to keep his face neutral. A pair of aces. It was a strong hand, but not unbeatable. The other players remained stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. One by one, they revealed their cards. The first had a pair of queens, no match for Eddie's aces. The second had a straight, which put Eddie on edge, but he was still in the game. The third, however, was the one who sent a cold chill down his spine. A flush. He'd lost. Eddie stared at the cards in disbelief as the other player scooped up the massive pile of chips. It was over. The $500,000 was gone, and with it, any hope Eddie had of escaping the life he'd been living. Victor's words echoed in his mind. it wouldn't be in your best interest to lose. As the reality of his situation set in, Eddie felt the weight of his decision crushing him. He had gambled with money that wasn't his, and now he had nothing to show for it but an empty pit in his stomach and a looming sense of dread that he pushed back from the table, his movements slow and deliberate, as if in a daze. The other players barely glanced at him as he stood, their attention already shifting to the next hand. To them, he was just another gambler who had lost big. But to Eddie, this loss was everything. As he walked away from the table, the bright lights of the casino seemed to dim, and the sounds of the slot machines and chatter faded into the background. He felt as though he was moving through a fog, each step heavier than the last. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and he had no idea what he was going to do next. Outside the casino, the night air was cool against his flushed skin. Eddie leaned against a wall, trying to steady his breathing. His mind raced, searching for a way out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see a way to fix this. The $500,000 was gone, and with it, any chance of a normal life. Eddie had always known the risks of gambling, but he had never imagined it would lead to something like this. Now, as he stood alone in the darkness, he realized that he had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Eddie hesitated before pulling it out, already dreading what he knew was coming. The message was short, just a few words that sent a fresh wave of fear through him. "You owe me. We'll be in touch." Eddie stared at the screen, the words blurring as his mind raced. He had no idea who Victor really was or what he was capable of, but one thing was clear: Eddie was in deep, and he had no idea how he was going to get out. With a sinking feeling, Eddie realized that his life was no longer his own. The $500,000 was just the beginning, and whatever came next was going to be far worse. He had made a losing hand, and now he was going to have to pay the price. Eddie barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory of the poker game played on a loop in his mind: the final card, the crushing realization, the other player's triumphant smirk as he raked in the chips. But worse than the loss was the looming threat of what came next. He had gambled with money that wasn't his, and now he had to face the consequences. By morning, Eddie's anxiety had grown into a gnawing dread. He knew that Victor would come calling soon, and when he did, Eddie needed to be ready. But how could he possibly be ready for what was coming? He had nothing to give, no way to pay back the $500,000 he'd lost. That he forced himself out of bed and into the shower, the hot water doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. As he dressed, his hands trembled, the enormity of his situation weighing heavily on him. He needed to think, to come up with a plan, but his mind was clouded with fear. Eddie's phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, his heart sinking when he saw the number. Unknown. His fingers hovered over the screen, dread coiling in his stomach. Finally, he answered. "Eddie," a voice greeted him, calm but with an edge that sent a chill down his spine. It was Victor. "I'm going to make this simple," Victor continued. "You owe me $500,000. I expect you to pay it back." Eddie's throat tightened, his mind racing. I don't have that kind of money. I need time." Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Time is something you don't have, Eddie. I'm not a patient man. You have 1 week to get me my money. If you don't, there will be consequences. And trust me, you don't want to find out what those are." The line went dead, leaving Eddie standing in the middle of his tiny apartment, paralyzed with fear. 1 week. That was all the time he had to come up with $500,000. It was impossible. He didn't even have a fraction of that. Desperation gnawed at him as he tried to think of a way out. He could sell everything he owned, but it wouldn't make a dent in the debt. He could try to borrow from friends, but who would lend him that kind of money? The truth was, there was no one he could turn to. Eddie had burned too many bridges in his life, and now he was paying the price that he paced the small living room, his thoughts spiraling. Maybe he could go back to the casino, try to win back what he'd lost. But that idea was as ridiculous as it was dangerous. He had already lost everything once. There was no reason to believe his luck would turn now. A knock at the door startled him, and Eddie froze, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he considered not answering, but the knocking grew more insistent. Reluctantly, he approached the door and opened it a crack. 2 men stood on the other side, both dressed in dark suits, their expressions cold and unyielding. They were the kind of men who didn't need to speak to convey their message. Their presence alone was enough to make Eddie's blood run cold. "Mr. Blake," one of the men said, his voice low and menacing. "We're here on behalf of Victor. He's very serious about getting his money back." I understand," Eddie stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm working on it, I just need a little more time." The man's expression didn't change. "Time's running out, Mr. Blake. We'll be back in a few days. You'd better have something for us when we return." Eddie nodded frantically, his hands trembling as he clutched the doorframe. The 2 men turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway, shaking with fear. As they disappeared down the hallway, Eddie closed the door and leaned against it, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. This was worse than he had imagined. Victor wasn't just going to let this go. He had sent enforcers to remind Eddie of the stakes, and the next visit would likely be much worse if he didn't come up with the money. Panic set in as Eddie realized just how trapped he was. He had no money, no resources, and no one to turn to. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. The reality of his situation was suffocating, and for the first time, he felt completely and utterly hopeless. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eddie tried to come up with a plan, but every idea led to a dead end. He considered going to the police, but what could he tell them? That he had lost $500,000 of someone else's money in a poker game? They would laugh him out of the station, if they didn't arrest him first. As the sun began to set, Eddie found himself sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He poured himself a glass, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. Drinking wouldn't solve anything, but it was the only comfort he had left. He took a long sip, the alcohol burning as it went down. It dulled the edge of his fear, but only slightly. His mind kept returning to Victor's words, the threat hanging over him like a guillotine. There will be consequences. Eddie knew he was running out of time. He had 1 week to come up with the money, or he would face whatever Victor had in store for him. The thought made his blood run cold, but there was nothing he could do. He was out of options. As the night wore on, Eddie's thoughts grew darker. He couldn't see a way out of this, and the pressure was crushing him. He had always been a gambler, always willing to take risks, but this was different. This was a no-win situation, and the more he thought about it, the more hopeless he felt. Finally, as the clock ticked past midnight, Eddie made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and there was only one person who might be able to give it to him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. His finger hovered over the call button for a moment, doubt gnawing at him. But he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, Eddie pressed the button and raised the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before a voice answered Eddie. The voice was familiar, concerned. "What's going on? It's been a while." Eddie closed his eyes, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "I'm in trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice responded, "Tell me what happened." Eddie took a deep breath and began to explain, knowing that this was his last chance. He had 1 week to make things right, and if he failed, the consequences would be dire. Eddie's plea for help had been met with silence at first. The person on the other end of the line, an old friend named Charlie, had listened quietly as Eddie explained the situation. But when Eddie finally finished, the silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Eddie," Charlie had said after a long pause, his voice tinged with disappointment, "I don't know what you want me to do. You've put yourself in an impossible situation. I can't bail you out of this." Eddie had pleaded, desperation seeping into his voice. He'd tried to explain how dire things were, how he had no one else to turn to. But Charlie had been firm. "You've got to figure this out on your own, man. I'm sorry, but I can't help you this time." That conversation replayed in Eddie's mind as he wandered the streets, the weight of his predicament pressing down on him. He had spent the last few days trying to find a solution, reaching out to anyone who might be able to lend him money or offer advice. But every call ended the same way, with a polite refusal or, worse, an angry lecture. His reputation had finally caught up with him. Years of gambling, lying, and taking advantage of people had left him with few allies. Those who might have helped him once were now too wary, too burned by his past behavior. Eddie had alienated nearly everyone who had ever cared about him, and now, when he needed them the most, they were nowhere to be found. Eddie hadn't been back to his apartment since the debt collector's visit. The thought of returning there, of possibly facing Victor's enforcers again, was too much to bear. Instead, he drifted from place to place, crashing on couches when he could, sleeping in his car when he couldn't. It was a miserable existence, but it was better than the alternative. As the days passed, Eddie's desperation deepened. His attempts to raise money grew more frantic, more reckless. He even tried to sell his car, but the amount he was offered was a pittance compared to what he owed. It was clear that no matter what he did, he was never going to come up with the $500,000 in time. One afternoon, after another failed attempt to borrow money from a distant relative, Eddie found himself sitting alone in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly empty, the kind of dive where people went to disappear. Eddie stared into his drink, the ice slowly melting as he considered his options, or lack thereof. He was spiraling, and he knew it. The fear and desperation had turned into a gnawing despair, a sense of inevitability that he couldn't shake. He was out of time, out of options, and out of hope. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him feeling hollow and numb. As he downed his drink, a familiar voice cut through the haze. "Eddie Blake, as I live and breathe." Eddie looked up to see Lisa, an ex-girlfriend he hadn't seen in years, standing at the bar. She was dressed in a way that suggested her life had taken a turn for the better since they'd last seen each other. Elegant clothes, a confident air, but the look in her eyes was wary. "Lisa," Eddie muttered, surprised to see her here. "What are you doing in a place like this?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, sliding onto the stool next to him. "But I guess I already know the answer." Eddie flinched at the truth in her words. Lisa had known him during one of his better periods, when he'd managed to hold down a steady job and stay out of trouble, at least for a while. But even then, his gambling habit had been a constant source of tension between them, one that eventually drove them apart. "You look like hell," Lisa said, her tone softer now, more concerned. "What's going on, Eddie?" He hesitated, debating whether to tell her the truth. Part of him wanted to open up, to finally share the burden he was carrying. But another part, the part that had driven everyone away, wanted to keep it to himself, to push her away before she could reject him like everyone else had. In the end, the need for connection won out. Eddie told her everything, about the poker game, the $500,000, Victor's threats. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to make himself look better. He just laid it all out, the raw, ugly truth of his situation. Lisa listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she let out a long sigh. "Eddie, I always knew you had a problem, but this is something else." "I know," Eddie said, his voice cracking. "I screwed up, Lisa. I screwed up bad." She nodded, her eyes sad but not unsympathetic. "And now you're here, alone, with nowhere to turn." "Yeah," Eddie admitted. "I guess I hit rock bottom." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Lisa reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Look, I can't give you the money. But I know someone who might be able to help you, in a different way. He's a financial counselor, specializes in helping people who are in deep. Maybe he can help you figure something out." Eddie took the card, staring at the name printed on it. It wasn't a solution, but it was something, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness that had swallowed him whole. "Thanks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. Just, don't make the same mistakes again, Eddie," Lisa said, standing up to leave. "You've got to want to change. No one can do that for you." Eddie watched her go, feeling a mix of gratitude and shame. He had hit rock bottom, but maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely out of options. But as he walked out of the bar into the night, the weight of his reality settled back on his shoulders. He still had to face Victor, still had to deal with the debt that hung over his head like a noose. And deep down, he knew that no matter how hard he tried to rebuild, the past had a way of catching up. As Eddie wandered through the dark streets, the card in his hand felt like a lifeline. But whether he would grab hold of it or let himself drown was a choice only he could make. And in that moment, Eddie wasn't sure he had the strength to make the right one. The morning after his encounter with Lisa, Eddie woke up in his car, stiff and groggy. The business card she had given him sat on the dashboard, a small, but significant, reminder of the slim hope he had been offered. As the sunlight streamed through the windshield, Eddie sat up, staring at the card. The name on it was Frank Gallagher, followed by a title, Financial Counselor and Recovery Specialist. Eddie wasn't sure what a recovery specialist did, but he knew he didn't have much to lose by finding out. With no other plan in mind, he decided to give it a shot. After all, Lisa had gone out of her way to help him, and maybe this Frank guy really could offer some kind of solution. That he found a nearby cafe with free Wi-Fi and spent a few minutes gathering his thoughts over a cup of coffee. Then, with a deep breath, Eddie dialed the number on the card. The phone rang a few times before a warm, confident voice answered. Frank Gallagher speaking. Hi, Eddie said, unsure of how to start. My name's Eddie Blake. A friend of mine gave me your card. She said you might be able to help. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Eddie, it's good to hear from you. Lisa told me about you. Why don't you come by my office this afternoon? We can talk more about what's going on and see if we can come up with a plan. Eddie agreed, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. After hanging up, he finished his coffee, trying to suppress the gnawing doubt that threatened to derail him. This was his last shot at getting back on track, and he couldn't afford to blow it. Later that day, Eddie arrived at Frank's office, a modest space in a building that had seen better days. The waiting room was small but tidy, with a few well-worn chairs and a stack of magazines on a coffee table. As he sat down, Eddie noticed a framed picture on the wall, a photo of Frank, younger and healthier looking, standing next to a row of poker tables. The caption read, National Poker Championship, 2001. A few minutes later, the door to Frank's office opened, and the man himself stepped out. He was older now, his hair mostly gray, but his eyes were sharp and full of life. He greeted Eddie with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. Eddie, glad you could make it, Frank said, leading him into the office. Come on in. Let's talk. Frank's office was as unassuming as the waiting room, with a simple desk, a couple of chairs, and more photos lining the walls, some of Frank with what looked like family, others with various trophies and plaques. Eddie couldn't help but notice that Frank had once been deeply involved in the world of gambling, and it made him wonder what had led the man to become a recovery specialist. Once they were seated, Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Eddie with a kind but discerning gaze. So, Lisa told me a bit about your situation. You've had a rough time lately, haven't you? Eddie nodded, feeling a pang of shame. Yeah, you could say that. I lost a lot of money, $500,000 to be exact. And it wasn't mine. Now I'm in deep with some very dangerous people. Frank didn't flinch at the amount, though Eddie noticed his expression tighten slightly. "I've been there, Eddie. I know what it's like to lose big and feel like there's no way out. But the fact that you're here, talking to me, means you haven't given up yet. That's a good sign." Eddie shrugged, feeling more defeated than hopeful. "I don't know what else to do. I'm out of options, and I'm scared. These people, they're not the kind you can just walk away from." Frank nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I get it. But there's always a way forward, even when it seems impossible. First, we need to get a handle on your situation. You mentioned the money wasn't yours. Can you tell me more about where it came from and who you owe it to?" Eddie hesitated, then started to explain everything: how he'd borrowed the money from Victor, a local loan shark with a reputation for brutality, thinking he could double it in one night of high-stakes poker. How he'd lost it all, and now faced threats from Victor's enforcers. The more he talked, the more the weight of his situation seemed to lift, if only slightly. Frank listened intently, not interrupting, just letting Eddie unburden himself. When Eddie finally finished, Frank leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, you need to stop thinking about this in terms of gambling your way out. That path only leads to more trouble. You need to face this head-on, and I can help you do that." Eddie frowned, confused. "How? I don't have the money, and Victor's not exactly the kind of guy who accepts apologies." "True," Frank agreed. "But I know how these guys operate. They're bullies, but they're also businessmen. They want their money, and they'll take it however they can get it. What we need to do is negotiate a way for you to pay it back over time, in a way that's manageable. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's possible." Eddie felt a flicker of hope, though it was quickly tempered by doubt. "Do you really think Victor will go for that? He seemed pretty clear that he wants his money, and soon." "Leave that to me," Frank said confidently. "I've dealt with his type before. It'll take some convincing, but if we approach him the right way, we might be able to buy you some time. In the meantime, you need to start making changes in your life, serious changes. If you're going to survive this, you have to commit to getting clean and staying away from the tables." Eddie swallowed hard, the enormity of what Frank was saying sinking in. "I don't know if I can do that, Frank. I've been gambling for so long, it's all I know." "I understand," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you're at a crossroads, Eddie. You can either keep going down this path and end up in a much worse place, or you can take this chance to turn things around. It won't be easy, but I'll be here to help you every step of the way." For the first time in what felt like forever, Eddie saw a glimmer of a future that wasn't shrouded in darkness. Frank was offering him a way out, not just from his immediate crisis, but from the destructive cycle he'd been trapped in for years. It was a lifeline, and Eddie knew he had to grab it, even if it was terrifying. "Okay," Eddie said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes." Frank smiled, a look of approval in his eyes. "Good. We'll take this one step at a time. First, we'll deal with Victor, and then we'll start working on you. It's going to be tough, but you're tougher. You can do this, Eddie." As Eddie left Frank's office that day, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't out of the woods yet, far from it, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but with Frank's help, he had a chance, and for Eddie, a chance was more than he'd had in a long time. The days following his meeting with Frank Gallagher were filled with a mix of cautious optimism and relentless hard work. Eddie knew that turning his life around wasn't going to be instantaneous. It would require patience, persistence, and a lot of effort. Frank had outlined a plan for him, which began with confronting Victor and then focusing on rebuilding his life from the ground up. Eddie's first challenge was finding a job. His gambling habit had left him with a series of short-term gigs and a resume marred by gaps and poor references. Still, he was determined to start fresh, and he approached the job search with renewed vigor. He spent his mornings scouring job boards and filling out applications. His evenings were dedicated to updating his resume and practicing for interviews. It wasn't easy, rejection came frequently, and the sting of each denial reminded him of the long road ahead. But Eddie pressed on, motivated by the small flicker of hope that had sparked within him. His persistence eventually paid off when he landed a job as a warehouse worker at a local distribution center. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and for now, that was what mattered most. The work was physically demanding, but Eddie welcomed the chance to prove himself and earn a legitimate income. Every paycheck was a step toward redemption, a tangible sign that he was on the right path. As Eddie settled into his new routine, he faced another crucial task: reconnecting with his estranged daughter, Emily. Their relationship had deteriorated over the years due to his gambling and the emotional distance that had grown between them. Eddie knew that mending their bond wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make amends. He hadn't seen Emily in over a year, and he wasn't sure how she would react to hearing from him. The last time they spoke, their conversation had ended in anger and frustration, with Emily expressing her disappointment and hurt. Eddie had given her space since then, respecting her need for distance, but now he felt it was time to reach out. He found her contact information through his old address book and hesitated for a moment before dialing her number. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before Emily's voice answered. "Hello." "Hi, Emily. It's Dad," Eddie said, his voice trembling. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." There was a pause on the other end, and Eddie could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Dad? It's been a while. What do you want?" Eddie took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect things to be the same. I just wanted to call and let you know that I'm trying to turn things around. I've started a new job, and I'm getting help. I'm not asking for anything, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry, and I'd like to try to make things right." Emily's silence was deafening. Eddie held the phone tightly, his heart pounding as he waited for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now but still guarded. "I appreciate that you're reaching out, Dad. It's good to hear that you're trying to get better. But it's going to take time for me to trust you again. I'm glad you're working on yourself, but I need to see that it's real before I can get involved." Eddie nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm committed to making things right. Whenever you're ready, I'd like to see you. Emily's voice softened further. Okay, Dad. I'll think about it. Maybe we can talk again soon. As the call ended, Eddie felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. It was a small step, but it was a start. He knew that rebuilding his relationship with Emily would take time, and he had to be patient and respectful of her boundaries. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. In addition to his new job and efforts to reconnect with Emily, Eddie continued working with Frank Gallagher. They had successfully negotiated a repayment plan with Victor, allowing Eddie to pay back the debt in manageable installments. While the threat of violence still loomed, the arrangement provided some breathing room and a sense of control. Eddie had also begun attending support groups for gamblers. It was a difficult experience. Confronting his addiction and the damage it had caused was painful. But he found solace in hearing others' stories and sharing his own. The support group provided a sense of community and accountability that Eddie hadn't realized he needed. The days turned into weeks, and Eddie's life slowly began to stabilize. The constant stress of his past decisions began to lessen, replaced by the more manageable pressures of work, repayment, and personal recovery. Though there were still moments of doubt and fear, Eddie clung to the progress he had made and the hope that things could continue to improve. One evening, after a long day at the warehouse, Eddie returned to his small apartment and found a letter waiting for him in the mail. It was from Emily, and his hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, he found a short, handwritten note. Dear Dad, thank you for reaching out. I'm glad to hear that you're working on turning things around. It's not going to be easy for either of us, but I'm willing to start with small steps. I'd like to meet up sometime next week, just to talk and see where things are. Let me know when you're free. Emily. Eddie stared at the letter, a mixture of relief and excitement flooding over him. The prospect of seeing Emily again, of beginning to repair their fractured relationship, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. As he set the letter down, he felt a small but significant shift within himself. The journey was far from over, and there were still many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Eddie felt that he was moving towards something better, a future where he could rebuild his life, restore broken relationships, and finally leave his past behind. Eddie knew there would be obstacles and setbacks along the way, but he was ready to face them. With each step he took, he was proving to himself that change was possible, and that he had the strength to forge a new path. The warehouse job had become a routine for Eddie, a steady rhythm that provided both a sense of stability and an opportunity for redemption. The days blurred together, marked by the constant hum of machinery and the steady stream of deliveries. Eddie appreciated the simplicity of his new life, but the shadow of his past was never far behind. One afternoon, while Eddie was on his break in the dingy break room, the door swung open, and a familiar face walked in. It was Tony Russo, an old gambling buddy from Eddie's past. Tony had been a frequent presence at the high-stakes tables, and Eddie had lost plenty of money to him over the years. "Hey, Eddie." Tony's voice was jovial, his smile wide as he approached. He wore a crisp suit, looking as if he'd just stepped out of a high-end casino. The sight of him triggered a mix of nostalgia and unease in Eddie. "Tony," Eddie said, trying to sound casual. "What brings you here?" Tony plopped down across from Eddie, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing. Haven't seen you around in a while. Heard you've been keeping a low profile." Eddie nodded, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, been trying to stay out of trouble. Working at the warehouse now." "Sounds like you're on the straight and narrow," Tony said, his tone deceptively sincere. "But, you know, I heard you had some trouble with those guys you owe money to. Must be a tough spot to be in." Eddie's gaze hardened. "Yeah, it's been rough. But I'm dealing with it." Tony leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "I get it. But, listen, I've got a little something that might interest you. A sure thing. No risk involved." Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, and the temptation was palpable. "What are you talking about?" Tony grinned. "I've got a line on a hot tip for a big game tonight. They're saying it's a sure win. All you need to do is place a bet, and you'll double your money. Quick cash, Eddie. Just like old times." The words hung in the air, heavy with allure. Eddie's mind raced as he weighed the offer. It sounded too good to be true, but the lure of easy money was difficult to ignore. The craving for the thrill, the taste of victory that came with a winning bet, was still a powerful force within him. Eddie's hands clenched into fists as he fought to maintain control. He remembered Frank's advice: stay away from gambling, focus on rebuilding his life. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the dangerous lure of falling back into old habits. "I've been trying to stay away from that stuff, Tony," Eddie said, his voice firm. "I'm trying to rebuild my life. I don't want to risk everything again." Tony's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Come on, Eddie. It's a one-time thing. Just a little bet. You could use the extra cash, right? It's not like you're gambling away your future. Just this once." Eddie shook his head. "No. I'm not interested. I'm done with that part of my life." Tony's expression shifted to one of disappointment mixed with frustration. "All right, if that's how you feel. Just thought I'd give you a chance. But you know where to find me if you change your mind." As Tony walked out of the break room, Eddie felt a rush of relief mixed with residual anxiety. The temptation had been strong, but he had resisted. He knew that every temptation was a test, and passing this one was crucial to his recovery. The rest of the day was a blur for Eddie. He tried to focus on his work, but the encounter with Tony had stirred up unsettling feelings. The allure of gambling was a constant, nagging presence, and the ease with which Tony had suggested a bet had reminded Eddie of just how quickly things could spiral out of control. That evening, Eddie went home and sat in his small apartment, staring at the walls. His mind replayed the conversation with Tony, and he struggled with the temptation that had reared its head. The old urges were powerful, and the thought of quick money was tantalizing. He reached for his phone and pulled up Frank's contact information. It was late, but Eddie needed to talk. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, Frank's voice answered. Frank Gallagher. Hey, Frank, Eddie said, trying to keep his voice steady. It's Eddie. I need to talk to you about something. Of course, Frank replied, his tone warm and reassuring. What's going on? Eddie took a deep breath. Tony Russo came by today. He offered me a bet. Sure thing, he said. I almost took it, but I didn't. I'm struggling with the temptation, and I need help to stay on track. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Frank spoke, his voice steady and calm. Eddie, you did the right thing by not taking the offer. Temptations will come, and it's important to stay vigilant. The fact that you reached out means you're aware of the risks and that you're committed to your recovery. That's a good sign. Eddie sighed, feeling a small sense of relief. I just don't want to fall back into old habits. It's so tempting, and I feel like I'm constantly battling with myself. Frank's voice was comforting. It's normal to feel that way. Recovery is a continuous process, and it involves facing those temptations head-on. Remember why you're doing this, your new job, your efforts to reconnect with Emily, and the progress you've made so far. Focus on those positives. You've come a long way, and you're strong enough to keep going. Eddie nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. Thanks, Frank. I needed to hear that. No problem, Eddie, Frank said. Stay strong, and don't hesitate to reach out if you need more support. You're not alone in this. As Eddie ended the call, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The temptation had been a test, and he had managed to resist. The road to recovery was far from easy, but with Frank's support and his own commitment, Eddie was beginning to find his way. That night, as he lay in bed, Eddie reflected on the day's events. The temptation had been real, but so was his resolve to build a better future. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, one step at a time. Eddie's resolve was tested in the days following his encounter with Tony Russo. The temptation to gamble lingered in the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. Every time he passed by a casino or saw an ad for online betting, he felt a pang of desire that threatened to undo all his hard work. It was a Friday evening, and Eddie had just finished a grueling shift at the warehouse. Exhausted, he headed home, eager to relax. But as he walked past a brightly lit casino on his way to his apartment, his steps slowed. The neon lights and the sound of clinking coins were almost hypnotic, calling to the part of him that had once reveled in the excitement of gambling. That he stood outside the casino for a few moments, his mind racing. The allure of easy money was strong, and the thought of escaping his financial troubles with a single bet seemed almost too good to pass up. Eddie's hand reached for his phone, and he started to type a message to Tony, considering the possibility of just one more bet, but then he stopped. He remembered Frank's words of encouragement and the progress he had made. He thought of his job, his efforts to rebuild his relationship with Emily, and the small victories he had achieved so far. He realized that giving in to this temptation would not only jeopardize his recovery but also undermine everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. To distract himself from the nagging urge, Eddie decided to go for a walk. The crisp evening air helped clear his mind as he strolled through the neighborhood, trying to focus on positive thoughts. He found himself near a park and decided to sit on a bench, gazing at the stars. It was a peaceful moment, and the tranquility of the park contrasted sharply with the chaos he had experienced in his gambling days. As he sat there, Eddie thought about his daughter Emily. Their recent conversation had left him hopeful, but he knew that reconnecting with her would take time and consistent effort. He needed to stay on the right path if he wanted to have a chance at rebuilding their relationship. The internal battle raged on as Eddie continued to walk. His mind was a battleground of conflicting desires, the temptation of quick money versus the commitment to a better life. The thrill of gambling was a powerful force, but Eddie was determined not to let it win. When he finally returned to his apartment, he felt emotionally drained but resolute. He took out his journal, a new habit he had picked up as part of his recovery process, and began to write. Journaling had become a valuable outlet for Eddie, helping him process his thoughts and feelings. In his journal, he wrote about his struggles and the temptation he had faced that evening. He reflected on how far he had come and how giving in to gambling would only lead him back to the dark place he had fought so hard to escape. He wrote about his desire to make amends and build a future, and how important it was to stay true to his goals. The following day, Eddie decided to call Frank Gallagher for support. He needed to talk about the temptation he had faced and get some advice on how to handle his cravings. Frank answered on the first ring, his voice steady and reassuring. "Hey, Eddie. How's it going?" "I've been struggling, Frank," Eddie admitted. "I had a hard time last night. I was really tempted to gamble again. I went by a casino, and it took everything I had to walk away." Frank listened attentively. "I'm glad you called. Temptation is a part of recovery, and it's something you'll have to deal with from time to time. It's important to recognize these moments and have strategies in place to handle them." Eddie nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. "What should I do when I feel this way?" "First, remember why you're in recovery," Frank advised. "Focus on your goals and the progress you've made. Remind yourself of the consequences of giving in and the benefits of staying on track. Also, it's important to have a support system. Reach out to people who understand what you're going through and can offer encouragement." "I've been trying to stay focused on my goals," Eddie said. "And I've been journaling, which helps. But the cravings are still strong sometimes." Frank's voice was calm and encouraging. "That's normal. The cravings can be intense, but they will pass. When you're feeling overwhelmed, find a healthy distraction or engage in activities that keep your mind off gambling. Stay active, pursue hobbies, and connect with people who support your recovery." With Frank's advice in mind, Eddie took proactive steps to manage his cravings. He started taking evening walks to clear his mind, focusing on the sights and sounds of the neighborhood rather than the lure of gambling. He also began volunteering at a local community center, finding fulfillment in helping others and keeping himself occupied. Eddie also reached out to Emily again, suggesting they meet for coffee. She agreed, and they arranged to meet the following weekend. The prospect of spending time with her was both exciting and nerve-wracking, but Eddie was determined to make the most of the opportunity. As the days went by, Eddie continued to face temptations, but he learned to manage them better. Each time he resisted, he felt a growing sense of pride and accomplishment. The small victories were building his resilience and reinforcing his commitment to a better life. He also started to notice changes in himself. He was more focused at work, more present in his interactions with others, and more hopeful about the future. The journey to recovery was far from easy, but Eddie was beginning to see the fruits of his efforts. That night, as Eddie lay in bed, he reflected on the progress he had made. The temptation to gamble had been strong, but he had resisted. He was building a new life, one step at a time, and with each step, he was moving closer to the future he wanted. The road ahead was still long, but Eddie was determined to stay on course and build a life he could be proud of. Eddie's struggle with temptation had taken a toll, but it had also ignited a spark within him. His journey through the dark days of gambling and the hard-won victory over his cravings had given him a newfound sense of purpose. He realized that his own recovery could be transformed into something more meaningful, helping others who faced the same battles he had once fought. One afternoon, Eddie was reading through an online support group forum dedicated to gambling addiction. As he scrolled through the posts, he was struck by the stories of individuals who, like him, had struggled with the overwhelming urge to gamble. Their stories of despair, hope, and recovery resonated deeply with him. He came across a post about a local organization that provided support for those dealing with gambling addiction. The organization offered counseling, group therapy, and educational programs. Eddie's interest was piqued. He felt a strong urge to get involved and give back. Using his own experiences to help others, Eddie decided to contact the organization, Path to Recovery, to inquire about volunteer opportunities. He spoke with Lisa, the program coordinator, who welcomed his interest with enthusiasm. Lisa explained that the organization was always in need of volunteers who could share their personal stories and offer support to those struggling. Eddie arranged to meet with Lisa and discuss how he could contribute. During their meeting, Lisa was impressed by Eddie's genuine desire to help and his willingness to use his own experiences to make a difference. "You have a powerful story, Eddie," Lisa said. "Your journey from addiction to recovery could inspire others who are just starting their own path. We'd love to have you as a volunteer." Eddie felt a surge of hope and excitement. This opportunity seemed like a perfect way to channel his experiences into something positive. He eagerly accepted the offer and began his training as a support volunteer. As part of his new role, Eddie attended training sessions where he learned how to facilitate support groups and provide guidance to those in need. He was introduced to various therapeutic techniques and strategies for helping individuals navigate their recovery journey. Eddie found the training both challenging and rewarding, and he was determined to be as effective as possible. One of his first tasks was to lead a support group session. He was nervous but excited to share his story. The room was filled with individuals who had faced similar struggles, and Eddie could see the pain and uncertainty in their eyes. When it was his turn to speak, Eddie took a deep breath and began to share his journey. He talked about his initial excitement about gambling, the highs and lows, and the devastating loss of $500,000 that wasn't his. He spoke honestly about the consequences he faced, his struggle with temptation, and the difficult but crucial decision to seek help and change his life. As Eddie shared his story, he noticed the impact it had on the group. The participants listened intently, and some nodded in understanding. A few of them even opened up about their own experiences, sharing their fears and challenges. After the session, several group members approached Eddie, expressing their gratitude for his honesty and the hope his story had given them. One young woman, in particular, was moved by Eddie's words. She admitted that she had been on the verge of giving up but felt renewed motivation after hearing his story. Eddie was touched by the responses. The feeling of making a difference, of providing support to those who needed it, was deeply fulfilling. He realized that helping others was not just a way to give back but also an integral part of his own healing process. In addition to leading support groups, Eddie began participating in outreach programs and educational workshops. He spoke at schools and community centers, sharing his story and educating people about the dangers of gambling addiction. His goal was to raise awareness and provide resources for those who might be struggling or at risk. Eddie also formed connections with other volunteers and professionals in the field. He learned from their experiences and insights, and together, they worked to improve the programs and support offered by Path to Recovery. As Eddie dedicated more time to helping others, he found that his own resolve strengthened. The sense of purpose he derived from his volunteer work became a powerful motivator, helping him stay focused on his recovery. The challenges he faced in his own life seemed more manageable when he was actively contributing to the well-being of others. His relationship with Emily also continued to improve. They had started meeting regularly, and Eddie's efforts to rebuild his life were evident in their conversations. Emily was proud of her father's commitment to helping others and supportive of his new purpose. One evening, as Eddie sat in his small apartment reflecting on the progress he had made, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His journey from addiction to recovery had led him to a new purpose, one that allowed him to use his experiences to make a positive impact on the lives of others. Eddie knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he was more prepared than ever to face them. His commitment to helping others had not only given him a renewed sense of purpose but also strengthened his own resolve to stay on the path of recovery. As he looked out the window at the city lights, Eddie felt hopeful about the future. He was building a new life, one marked by resilience, growth, and a dedication to making a difference. His journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next with courage and determination. Eddie's journey towards redemption had been fraught with challenges, but his dedication to helping others and his own personal growth had begun to show tangible results. As he continued his work with Path to Recovery and rebuilt his life, Eddie faced a crucial test, earning back the trust of those he had once hurt. This chapter of his life was about proving he had truly changed and mending the relationships that had been fractured by his past actions. One of Eddie's most significant challenges was reconciling with his estranged daughter, Emily. Their relationship had been strained for years, largely due to Eddie's gambling addiction and the chaos it had wrought on their lives. Although they had started meeting regularly, Emily's trust in her father had been hard to regain. Eddie reached out to Emily, suggesting they have a dinner together at a restaurant they both used to enjoy. It was a small, casual spot with a warm atmosphere, and Eddie hoped it would provide a relaxed setting for their conversation. When they met, Emily greeted him with a tentative smile. Eddie could see the lingering uncertainty in her eyes. He had learned to be patient and understanding, and he was determined to make this dinner a step towards rebuilding their relationship. Over the course of the meal, Eddie and Emily talked about their lives, their shared memories, and the changes that had occurred. Eddie was open and honest about his journey, sharing his experiences with gambling addiction and his efforts to make amends. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes," Eddie said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know that rebuilding trust is something that takes time. I want you to know that I'm committed to being a better person. Not just for me, but for you and everyone I've hurt." Emily listened intently, her expression softening as Eddie spoke. "I appreciate you sharing that with me, Dad. It's been hard for me to see the changes, especially since so much of what happened hurt me deeply. But I can see that you're working hard to turn things around." Eddie nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. "I understand that actions speak louder than words. I'm committed to proving that I've changed through my actions. I want to be a part of your life again and be the father you deserve." Emily's gaze was contemplative, and she seemed to be weighing Eddie's words carefully. "It's going to take time, Dad. I need to see that these changes are real and lasting. But I'm willing to try. I want us to have a better relationship, and I'm open to giving it a chance." In addition to his efforts with Emily, Eddie also reached out to others he had hurt in the past. He began contacting former colleagues and friends, people who had been affected by his gambling and the resulting financial and emotional damage. It wasn't an easy process. Many were initially skeptical or unwilling to engage with him. Eddie approached these conversations with humility and sincerity. He acknowledged the harm he had caused, expressed genuine remorse, and offered to make reparations where possible. For some, it was a slow process, but Eddie remained persistent and patient. One particular instance stood out to him. He contacted an old business partner, Greg, with whom he had had a contentious falling out due to unpaid debts and broken promises. Greg had been hesitant to meet, but Eddie's genuine apology and commitment to making things right eventually led to a meeting. "I know I owe you a lot," Eddie said during their conversation. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want to make amends. I've been working hard to pay off my debts and rebuild my life. If there's anything I can do to make things right with you, I want to do it." Greg looked at Eddie with a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "It's been a long time, Eddie. I didn't expect to hear from you. I appreciate your honesty, and I can see that you're making an effort. I'll think about how we can work this out." As Eddie continued his journey, he found that earning trust was a gradual process. It involved consistently demonstrating his commitment to change through his actions, not just his words. His dedication to helping others and his efforts to make amends were crucial steps in this process that he maintained his involvement with. Path to Recovery, becoming a mentor to individuals who were just starting their journey to recovery. His role as a mentor allowed him to further prove his commitment to helping others and solidified his own recovery by reinforcing the values he had embraced. Eddie also began participating in community events, using his story to raise awareness about gambling addiction and the importance of seeking help. His presence in these events was a testament to his dedication to making a positive impact on the community. Over time, Eddie began to see the fruits of his efforts. Relationships that had once seemed irreparably damaged were starting to heal. Emily began to open up more, and their interactions became more genuine and supportive. Former colleagues and friends began to acknowledge the positive changes in Eddie and were more willing to engage with him. Eddie felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he saw the results of his hard work. He knew that while he could never undo the past, he could strive to build a better future. His commitment to helping others and making amends was not just about seeking forgiveness but about creating a new identity for himself, one grounded in integrity, compassion, and resilience. As Eddie reflected on his journey, he recognized that becoming a better man was not just about overcoming his addiction but about transforming himself into someone who could positively impact others and rebuild the relationships he had once damaged. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes but by his efforts to make things right and the new life he was building. Eddie's path to redemption was ongoing, but he faced the future with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. His journey was far from over, but with each step, he was proving that he had truly changed and was committed to being a better man. Eddie's life had begun to stabilize. He had made strides in rebuilding relationships, helping others, and finding a new purpose. However, a shadow from his past was about to cast a long and ominous cloud over his newfound stability. The debt he owed was a lingering threat that had not been entirely resolved. The debt collector, a menacing figure from Eddie's gambling days, was about to make a dramatic return. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Eddie heard the firm knock on his apartment door. He was in the middle of reviewing some documents for a volunteer project and the sound interrupted his focus. The rhythmic, authoritative knocking was persistent and insistent, sending a shiver down his spine. Eddie opened the door to find himself face to face with a man he had hoped never to see again, Victor Malone, the debt collector. Victor was a tall, imposing figure with a stern expression and a reputation for being unyielding. His presence was enough to evoke a sense of dread. "Hello, Eddie," Victor said with a cold, calculated tone. "It's been a while." Eddie's heart raced, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "Victor, I didn't expect to see you." Victor's gaze was unwavering. "I've come to discuss the money you owe. It's been overdue for quite some time, and I need to know how you plan to settle it." Eddie stepped aside to let Victor into the apartment. The space that had become a sanctuary for him now felt claustrophobic under Victor's intimidating presence. Eddie invited him to sit, trying to remain calm despite the mounting anxiety. "I've been working hard to rebuild my life," Eddie began, hoping to appeal to Victor's sense of understanding. "I've made some progress, but the debt, it's a big burden, and I'm struggling to pay it off." Victor's expression remained stern. "I'm aware of your situation, Eddie, but that doesn't change the fact that the money is still owed. You made a deal, and now it's time to pay up. I need a clear plan for how you're going to handle this." Eddie took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I'm committed to paying off the debt, but it's going to take time. I've been working on rebuilding my life and helping others, and I'm doing everything I can to make good on my promises." Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not interested in excuses. I need specifics. How much can you pay now, and what's your plan for the remainder? Eddie's mind raced as he tried to come up with a feasible plan. He had been using his savings to make small payments and was doing his best to manage his finances, but he knew he couldn't meet the full amount immediately. I can offer a partial payment today, Eddie said, his voice steady but anxious. It's not the full amount, but it's what I can manage right now. I can also commit to a monthly payment plan to cover the rest. Victor's eyes remained cold and calculating. A partial payment isn't enough to satisfy the full debt. If you're serious about making amends, you need to come up with a more substantial offer. Otherwise, I'll have to escalate this matter. Eddie felt a wave of desperation. Please, Victor, I'm doing everything I can. I need more time. I'm committed to paying this off, but I can't meet the entire amount immediately. Victor's demeanor didn't soften. Time is something I can't extend indefinitely. I suggest you find a way to come up with the funds quickly or face the consequences. As Victor prepared to leave, he issued a final, chilling warning. I'll be back in a month to check on your progress. If you haven't made significant headway by then, you'll face severe consequences. This is your chance to make things right. Don't waste it. Eddie watched as Victor walked out of the apartment, the weight of the threat hanging heavy in the air. The encounter left him feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. The pressure to resolve the debt was mounting, and the looming threat of Victor's return was a stark reminder of the consequences of his past actions. In the days following the visit, Eddie was consumed by worry. He knew he needed to find a solution quickly to avoid further trouble. He reached out to Frank Gallagher for advice, explaining the situation and the looming deadline. Frank listened carefully and offered practical suggestions. You need to assess your finances and see if there are any areas where you can cut expenses or find additional sources of income. It might also be helpful to negotiate with Victor for a more manageable payment plan if possible. Eddie took Frank's advice to heart. He reviewed his budget meticulously, cutting unnecessary expenses and looking for ways to increase his income. He also explored potential side jobs and freelance opportunities to help bridge the financial gap. Eddie decided to meet with Victor again to propose a revised payment plan. He prepared thoroughly, presenting a detailed budget and a realistic plan for how he intended to pay off the debt. He hoped that by demonstrating his commitment and providing a clear plan, he might be able to negotiate more favorable terms. When Eddie met with Victor, he presented his proposal with determination. I've reviewed my finances and come up with a revised plan. I can offer a larger partial payment today and commit to a structured payment plan for the remaining balance. Here's the detailed plan. Victor reviewed the documents with a critical eye. After a tense silence, he nodded. This is a more reasonable approach. I'll consider your proposal, but don't think this is a free pass. I expect you to stick to this plan and provide regular updates. Any deviation will result in immediate action. With the new plan in place, Eddie felt a renewed sense of determination. The pressure was immense, but he was committed to facing the challenge head-on. The experience served as a stark reminder of the consequences of his past choices, but it also reinforced his resolve to maintain his commitment to recovery and personal growth. Eddie continued his volunteer work and focused on rebuilding his life, while also diligently working to meet the terms of the revised payment plan. The encounter with Victor had been a harsh reminder of the long shadows cast by his past, but it had also galvanized him to take control of his future. As Eddie navigated the challenges ahead, he did so with a clear understanding of the stakes and a steadfast commitment to overcoming the obstacles in his path. The journey was far from over, but Eddie was determined to prove that he had truly changed and was worthy of the second chance he had worked so hard to earn. Eddie had managed to create a semblance of stability in his life, with the revised payment plan in place and his commitment to recovery firmly established. But just as he began to feel a glimmer of hope, a new and perilous opportunity emerged. It was a chance to clear his debt in a way that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. One chilly evening, as Eddie was preparing for a support group meeting, his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, so the sudden sound caught him off guard. He opened the door to find a sharply dressed man with a confident demeanor, Carter Brooks, a known figure in the gambling world. "Eddie, right?" Carter asked with a friendly but guarded smile. "I'm Carter Brooks. I've heard about your situation and thought we might be able to help each other." Eddie's initial reaction was one of apprehension. "What do you want?" Carter's smile didn't waver. "I understand you have a debt you're working to pay off. I have a proposition that could help you clear that debt, if you're interested." Carter entered the apartment and took a seat, his presence imposing yet calm. He pulled out a folder and began to explain his offer. "There's an upcoming high-stakes poker game with a substantial buy-in. It's a private event, and the stakes are very high. I can get you an invitation and provide you with the buy-in funds. If you win, your debt is cleared. It's a straightforward deal." Eddie listened, his mind racing with the implications. The prospect of clearing his debt in one fell swoop was tempting, but the risk was enormous. He had promised himself never to return to gambling, yet here was an opportunity that could solve his financial troubles. "Why are you offering this to me?" Eddie asked cautiously. Carter leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of sincerity and calculation. "I'm in need of someone with your experience. You've been around the scene, and I think you could be a valuable asset. Plus, I'm offering this deal because I believe you're capable of succeeding." Eddie's hands trembled slightly as he processed the offer. The temptation was strong, but he knew he had to think carefully. "And if I refuse?" Carter's smile remained, but his tone grew more serious. "If you refuse, you'll still owe the debt, and Victor Malone won't wait forever. This is an opportunity to resolve things quickly, but it's up to you." As Carter left, Eddie was left alone with his thoughts. The proposition weighed heavily on his mind. On one hand, accepting the offer could mean a swift resolution to his financial troubles. On the other hand, it would mean returning to the gambling world, a world he had vowed to leave behind. Eddie reached out to Frank Gallagher, hoping to gain some perspective. Frank listened carefully as Eddie described the offer and the dangers it entailed. "This is a dangerous game, Eddie," Frank said cautiously. "Returning to gambling could undo all the progress you've made. You've worked hard to build a new life and help others. This offer might seem like a quick fix, but it's fraught with risks. Eddie nodded, feeling the weight of Frank's words. I know it's risky, but I also know how desperate I am to resolve this debt. I'm torn between the temptation and the consequences. Frank's advice was clear. Consider what's at stake. Think about your future and the people who care about you. Sometimes, the best way forward is to face the challenges head-on without resorting to old habits. The next day, Eddie made a decision. He would not accept Carter's offer. The risk of falling back into the gambling world was too great, and the potential consequences too severe. He was committed to his recovery and his new purpose in life, and he wasn't willing to jeopardize that for a chance at quick financial relief. He contacted Carter and politely declined the offer. Thank you for considering me, but I've decided not to take up your proposition. I'm committed to resolving my debt through other means and staying on the path of recovery. Carter's response was measured. I understand, Eddie. If you change your mind, the offer stands. Just remember, opportunities like this don't come around often. With the dangerous proposition behind him, Eddie refocused on his commitment to recovery and making amends. He continued working on his payment plan and sought additional ways to increase his income. His involvement with Path to Recovery remained a central part of his life, and he found solace in helping others who faced similar struggles. The decision to decline Carter's offer reinforced Eddie's resolve. It was a testament to his commitment to change and his dedication to rebuilding his life. The path ahead was still challenging, but Eddie faced it with renewed determination. As Eddie worked through his financial difficulties and continued his volunteer work, he began to see glimmers of hope. His relationship with Emily continued to improve, and he felt a deeper sense of purpose through his involvement in supporting others with gambling addiction. The shadow of his past still lingered, but Eddie was learning to navigate it with resilience and strength. Each step he took towards his goal of financial stability and personal redemption was a testament to his commitment to change. Eddie knew that the road to recovery was ongoing and fraught with challenges, but he was prepared to face it head-on. His decision to turn away from the dangerous proposition was a crucial moment in his journey, one that reinforced his dedication to building a better future for himself and those around him. As he looked ahead, Eddie felt a sense of determination and hope. He had chosen the path of integrity and recovery, and he was committed to seeing it through, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. Eddie's decision to decline Carter's dangerous offer had been resolute, yet the emotional and psychological toll of the choice continued to weigh heavily on him. The allure of a quick fix to his financial troubles was still a powerful temptation, and the pressure from his ongoing struggle to manage his debt only intensified the conflict within him. As Eddie wrestled with his choice, he found himself pulled in two conflicting directions. Days after turning down Carter's offer, Eddie felt the strain of his financial predicament more acutely. Despite his commitment to recovery and rebuilding his life, the reality of his situation was daunting. His job provided a modest income, but it wasn't enough to make significant headway on the debt. The monthly payments were barely scratching the surface, and the looming deadline for full repayment was a constant source of anxiety. Eddie's interactions with friends and family were strained. His daughter, Emily, had been supportive, but the stress was taking its toll on their relationship. She sensed Eddie's frustration and helplessness, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't fully understand the depth of his struggle. One evening, as Eddie was alone in his apartment, he received a call from Carter. The conversation was brief but unsettling. Carter's voice was smooth yet laced with an edge of impatience. "I just wanted to touch base, Eddie. Haven't heard from you in a while. Still sticking with your plan?" Eddie's response was guarded. "Yes, I'm staying on track. Trying to manage things the best I can." Carter's tone shifted slightly. "I hope you're not regretting your decision. Opportunities like the one I offered don't come around often. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." The conversation with Carter left Eddie uneasy. The temptation to return to gambling resurfaced, amplified by the mounting pressure of his financial struggles. He began to question whether he was making the right choice by sticking to his commitment. The thought of resolving his debt quickly, despite the risks, was increasingly appealing. Eddie started to spend more time reflecting on his past decisions and the path he had chosen. He revisited old places, met with former acquaintances, and even found himself drawn to the familiar buzz of gambling establishments. The internal battle between his old habits and his new resolve was growing fiercer. In an attempt to clear his mind, Eddie decided to visit Frank Gallagher. He needed someone to talk to, someone who understood the complexity of his situation. Frank welcomed him warmly, offering a cup of coffee and a listening ear. "Eddie, you look troubled," Frank observed as they sat down. "What's on your mind?" Eddie sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm torn, Frank. I thought I was doing the right thing by rejecting Carter's offer. But the pressure is overwhelming. My financial situation is getting worse, and the stress is affecting my relationships. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake." Frank leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I understand the pressure you're under. But remember why you chose the path you're on. You wanted to change your life, to rebuild it with integrity. The gambling world is a dangerous place, and it can pull you back in if you let it." Eddie nodded, struggling to maintain his focus. "I know, but it's hard to ignore the temptation. The idea of solving my problems quickly is really appealing, especially when everything feels so out of control." Frank's advice was clear but empathetic. "It's natural to feel conflicted, but you need to weigh the long-term consequences against the short-term gains. Consider the impact on your future, your relationships, and your personal integrity. The path you've chosen is challenging, but it's a path to genuine change and growth." As Eddie left Frank's office, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. The conversation had helped him refocus on his commitment to recovery, but the struggle was far from over. The temptation to return to gambling was still strong, and the financial pressure continued to build. One night, Eddie found himself unable to sleep. The weight of his decision was heavier than ever. He made a choice to visit a familiar casino, a place that had once been a second home to him. The lights and sounds of the gaming floor were a stark contrast to the serenity of his recovery efforts. As he walked through the casino, Eddie was approached by familiar faces, former gambling buddies and acquaintances. Their offers to join a game were tempting, but Eddie resisted. He wandered through the casino, struggling with the conflicting emotions of nostalgia and guilt. In a quiet moment, Eddie encountered Carter again. Carter's smile was as confident as ever. "Having second thoughts, Eddie?" Carter asked casually. "You know where to find me if you change your mind." Eddie's internal struggle reached a climax. He felt the weight of his past mistakes and the pull of his old habits. But deep down, he knew that succumbing to the temptation would undo all the progress he had made. The next morning, Eddie made a conscious decision. He would remain on the path of recovery, despite the temptation and the ongoing financial pressures. He realized that true change required steadfast commitment. Even in the face of adversity, Eddie reached out to Emily, seeking her support and understanding. He explained the internal struggle he had faced and reassured her of his dedication to recovery. Their conversation was heartfelt, and Emily's support provided Eddie with the strength he needed to continue. As Eddie moved forward, he focused on the positive steps he could take to improve his situation. He continued his volunteer work, built stronger relationships, and sought additional ways to manage his finances. The journey was challenging, but Eddie was committed to facing it with resilience and integrity. The internal battle between his past and his present was ongoing, but Eddie was determined to stay on the path of recovery. He understood that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to confront the challenges with renewed determination and hope. Eddie's choice to stay on the straight path was a testament to his commitment to personal growth and a better future. Despite the ongoing temptations and pressures, he remained focused on his goal of rebuilding his life and proving that he could overcome his past and forge a new path. Eddie's resolve to stay on the path of recovery had been strong, but the pressures of his financial situation and the lure of his past habits proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated. Despite his best efforts, Eddie found himself slipping back into old behaviors, driven by a mixture of desperation and temptation. It started with small compromises. Eddie began to skip support group meetings, telling himself he was too busy or too exhausted. The time he would have spent attending the meetings was instead used to manage mounting bills and stress. The more he isolated himself from his support network, the more vulnerable he became to old habits. One evening, Eddie found himself alone in his apartment, staring at a stack of overdue bills. The weight of his financial troubles seemed to grow heavier each day. Frustration and hopelessness gnawed at him, and the idea of gambling as a quick fix began to resurface. Eddie's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Jake, who had been a frequent presence in his gambling days. The message was brief but provocative. "Hey, Eddie, heard about a high-stakes game tonight. Could use an old hand. Interested?" The message stirred something within Eddie, a flicker of the old excitement and the familiar thrill of risk. He told himself it was just a harmless visit, a way to get his mind off things. He convinced himself that he could handle it and that it wouldn't lead him down a dangerous path. Against his better judgment, Eddie found himself walking into a casino later that evening. The atmosphere was intoxicating, the flashing lights, the clinking of chips, the hum of anticipation. Eddie's heart raced as he reconnected with familiar faces and felt the old allure of the gambling world. Jake greeted him with a knowing grin. "Glad you could make it. We've got a good game going, and I thought you might want to join." Eddie hesitated but then nodded. The temptation was too strong to resist, and the promise of a quick financial fix seemed too appealing. He took a seat at the poker table, trying to suppress the pangs of guilt and anxiety. As the game progressed, Eddie's initial cautiousness gave way to a sense of exhilaration. The cards were dealt, and with each hand, he felt a rush that he hadn't experienced in months. He was winning, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. However, as the night wore on, Eddie's luck began to turn. The wins turned into losses, and the stakes grew higher. He found himself caught in a vicious cycle of hope and despair, chasing losses and trying to regain control. The old habits re-emerged with a vengeance. Eddie ignored the voice of reason in his head, the reminders of his commitment to recovery, and the advice he had received from Frank. He was engulfed by the thrill of gambling and the desperation to solve his financial woes quickly. When the night ended, Eddie left the casino feeling defeated. He had lost more than he had intended and was left with a deep sense of regret. The euphoric high he had experienced was overshadowed by a profound low, a stark reminder of why he had sworn off gambling in the first place. Eddie's return to gambling had immediate consequences. He struggled to manage his finances, falling further behind on his bills. His interactions with Emily became strained once again, as she noticed his erratic behavior and the mounting stress he was under. Eddie's relationship with Frank also suffered. When Eddie missed a scheduled meeting with him, Frank grew concerned and reached out. Their conversation revealed the depth of Eddie's struggles. "I thought you were committed to staying on track," Frank said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "You've slipped back into old habits, and it's affecting everyone around you." Eddie felt a wave of guilt and shame. "I know, Frank. I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I've lost control again." The realization of how much he had jeopardized his recovery weighed heavily on Eddie. He knew he needed to confront his actions and face the consequences of his relapse. He reached out to Emily and explained the situation, admitting his failure and expressing his regret. Emily's response was a mix of hurt and understanding. "I know you're struggling, Dad, but I need you to be honest with me. We can get through this, but you have to be committed to getting help." Eddie agreed to seek additional support. He reconnected with his support group and began attending meetings more regularly. He also sought professional counseling to address the underlying issues contributing to his gambling addiction. Eddie's return to gambling was a harsh lesson in the difficulty of overcoming old habits. The road to recovery was far from straightforward, and the temptation to revert to past behaviors remained a constant challenge. However, Eddie was determined to learn from his mistakes and continue working towards his goals. With renewed resolve, Eddie focused on repairing the damage he had caused and rebuilding his life. He was committed to making amends and finding a healthier way to cope with the pressures he faced. Despite the setbacks, Eddie found a glimmer of hope in his renewed efforts. His support network rallied around him, offering encouragement and understanding. He began to rebuild trust with Emily and others, slowly regaining a sense of stability. Eddie's journey was far from over, but he was determined to face the challenges with a renewed sense of purpose. The path to recovery was fraught with obstacles, but Eddie was committed to overcoming them and forging a new, healthier path for himself. As he moved forward, Eddie knew that old habits would continue to pose a threat, but he was prepared to confront them head-on. The lessons learned from his relapse were painful, but they also strengthened his resolve to achieve lasting change and build a better future. Eddie stood at a crossroads, the weight of his recent relapse pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had managed to pull himself out of the darkest corners before, but now, with everything on the line, he found himself contemplating a decision that could either salvage the remnants of his life or plunge him into irreversible ruin. In the days following his relapse, Eddie threw himself back into his recovery, but the financial pressures continued to mount. His debts were still looming, and the threat from those he owed was becoming increasingly real. The fear of losing everything, his daughter, his sobriety, his life, consumed him. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that time was running out. The thought of making one last bet, a single, decisive gamble, began to dominate his mind. He knew it was risky, perhaps even foolish, but he also knew that it might be his only chance to clear his debt and regain control of his life. If the universe had read his thoughts, Eddie received a call from Jake, the same friend who had lured him back into gambling. Jake's tone was urgent, almost conspiratorial. "Eddie, there's a game tonight. High stakes, big rewards. I'm talking about enough money to wipe out your debt and then some. It's risky, but if you're in, this could be your shot." Eddie hesitated, the words hanging in the air. He had promised himself, and those he loved, that he wouldn't fall back into old habits. Yet, the idea of a last chance bet, one that could solve all his problems in a single night, was almost too tempting to resist. "Where is it?" Eddie finally asked, his voice betraying his internal conflict. Jake gave him the details, and Eddie knew that the decision he was about to make could either save him or lead to his ultimate downfall. That evening, Eddie found himself at an exclusive underground poker game. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the players around the table seasoned gamblers with cold, calculating eyes. Eddie felt a shiver of both fear and anticipation as he took his seat. This was it, the moment of truth. The game began slowly, with Eddie playing conservatively, carefully watching the other players. He reminded himself of everything he had learned, trying to stay focused and calm. But as the night wore on, the stakes rose higher and higher, and the pressure began to mount. Eddie's heart pounded as he made his moves, each decision a calculated risk. He won a few hands, lost others, but managed to stay in the game. As the pot grew, so did the tension, until finally, only two players remained, Eddie and a sharp-eyed man who seemed to read everyone at the table like an open book. The final hand was dealt, and Eddie stared at his cards, trying to keep his expression neutral. He had a decent hand, but it wasn't a sure thing. He could fold, walk away with some of his money intact, or go all in, betting everything on this one last chance. Eddie's thoughts raced. He could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. The safe move was to fold, to walk away with what he had and continue his slow climb out of debt. But something inside him pushed him toward the risk, the allure of winning big, the idea that this one hand could be the answer to all his problems. With a deep breath, Eddie made his decision. He pushed his entire stack of chips into the center of the table. "All in," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. The other player studied him for a long moment, then nodded and matched Eddie's bet. The cards were revealed, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Eddie's hand was good, very good. But as the other players' cards were flipped, Eddie's heart sank. He had lost by a narrow margin, the other player's hand just barely better than his own. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was over. The room seemed to close in around him as the other player raked in the winnings. Eddie sat there, numb, unable to fully process what had just happened. He had risked everything, and now he had nothing left. Jake approached him after the game, his expression a mix of sympathy and regret. "I'm sorry, Eddie. I really thought you had it." Eddie nodded absently, barely hearing Jake's words. The weight of his loss settled over him like a heavy cloak, and he felt the crushing reality of what he had done. He had gambled his last chance and lost, and now there was no going back. As Eddie left the underground game, the gravity of his situation began to sink in. The debt collectors would come for him soon, and this time, there was no way to pay them off. His relationships, his recovery, everything he had worked so hard to rebuild, he had thrown it all away in a single night. Eddie walked the dark streets in a daze, his mind racing with fear and regret. He had no idea what to do next, where to go, or how to face the people he had let down. The last chance bet that was supposed to save him had instead pushed him to the brink of total destruction. As he wandered aimlessly, Eddie knew he had to make a choice. He could give in to despair, let the consequences of his actions consume him, or he could find a way to pick up the pieces and start over. No matter how impossible it seemed, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of determination still burned. Eddie had faced rock bottom before, and while this was different, darker and more desperate, he knew that giving up wasn't an option. He had made a catastrophic mistake, but he was still alive, and as long as he was, there was a chance to make things right. With that thought, Eddie began to formulate a plan. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew he had to find a way to survive, to rebuild, and to prove that even in the face of devastating loss, he could rise again. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and difficulty, but Eddie was determined to take it. He had lost everything, but in that loss, he found a new resolve. He would not let this defeat define him. The last chance bet may have failed, but Eddie was not finished yet. The morning after the game, Eddie woke up to the harsh reality of his situation. The weight of the previous night's events settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His mind was a whirlwind of regret, fear, and despair. The last chance bet had been a desperate move, and now he was left to deal with the consequences. Eddie's phone buzzed incessantly with messages and missed calls. He knew without looking who they were from: the debt collectors, the people who had fronted him the money he had just lost. They wouldn't wait long, and Eddie understood that the time for excuses had run out. That he needed to face the reality of his situation, but first, he needed to clear his head. The walls of his small apartment felt like they were closing in on him, so he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at his face as he walked aimlessly through the city. It wasn't long before Eddie found himself standing in front of a small, dingy diner. He hesitated, then pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling as he stepped inside. It was a place he had frequented in better days, and the familiarity brought a brief sense of comfort. As he sat down at a booth, a man in a dark suit slid into the seat across from him. Eddie recognized him instantly, one of the collectors. The man's face was impassive, his eyes cold and calculating. "We've been looking for you, Eddie," the man said, his voice low and steady. "It seems you found yourself in quite a bit of trouble." Eddie nodded, knowing there was no point in trying to sugarcoat the situation. "I lost the money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anything left." The man leaned back, folding his arms across his chest as he studied Eddie. "That's not what we want to hear, Eddie. You know the deal. We gave you a chance, and you blew it. Now, we need to settle this." Eddie's heart raced. "I'll pay it back," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "Just give me a little more time. I can figure something out." The man shook his head slowly. "Time's up, Eddie. You've had plenty of chances, and you've squandered every one. Now, we're done playing games." The man's cold, unyielding tone sent a chill down Eddie's spine. He knew what was coming next. The man signaled to someone outside, and within moments, 2 more men entered the diner, their expressions grim. Eddie barely had time to react before they grabbed him, dragging him out of the booth and out into the alley behind the diner. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped his heart. The men didn't waste any time. One of them held Eddie against the wall while the other delivered a series of hard, punishing blows. Pain exploded in Eddie's ribs, his stomach, his face. He tried to curl into a protective ball, but they didn't relent. As the beating continued, Eddie's thoughts blurred with pain and fear. This was it, this was what his decisions had led to. He had gambled away his life, and now he was paying the price. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the men stopped. They released Eddie, letting him crumple to the ground in a heap. The man in the suit crouched down beside him, his voice eerily calm. "Consider this a lesson, Eddie. You're lucky we're letting you walk away from this. But don't mistake our generosity for weakness. If you don't find a way to pay us back, this will seem like a kindness." With that, the man stood up and walked away, the other 2 men following close behind. Eddie lay there in the alley, gasping for breath, his body racked with pain. He had never felt so broken, so utterly defeated. Hours later, after the sun had begun to set, Eddie managed to drag himself back to his apartment. Every step was agony, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't stay in the alley, he needed to get home, to regroup, to figure out what to do next. When he finally made it inside, he collapsed onto his bed, his body screaming in protest. For a long time, he lay there, unable to move, his mind spinning with despair. He had hit rock bottom before, but this was different. This felt final, like there was no way back. But as he lay there, a thought began to take shape in his mind, a tiny flicker of hope in the darkness. He had survived the beating, and he was still alive. That meant he still had a chance, no matter how slim. Eddie knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and he needed to reach out to those who had once cared about him, even if they had every reason to turn him away. He had made a mess of his life, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to make things right. The next morning, despite the pain and the fear, Eddie picked up the phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the number of the one person he had been avoiding, the one person he knew could help him, if they were willing to give him another chance. "Dad, came the hesitant voice on the other end. It was his daughter, the one he had pushed away in his darkest days. "Yeah, it's me," Eddie said, his voice choked with emotion. I need your help." There was a long pause, and Eddie's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what she would say, but he knew he had to try. "Come over," she finally said. "We'll figure it out." Eddie felt a surge of relief, but also a deep sense of shame. He had let her down so many times before, but here she was, willing to help him once again. He knew this was his last chance, and he was determined not to waste it. As he hung up the phone, Eddie took a deep breath. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had made his final bet, and while it hadn't turned out the way he had hoped, it had brought him to a new understanding. Eddie knew now that he couldn't gamble his way out of his problems. The only way forward was to take responsibility for his actions, to face the consequences, and to rebuild his life one step at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to try, and with that resolve, Eddie began the slow, painful journey toward redemption. The final hand had been played, and while he had lost the bet, he had gained something far more valuable: a second chance at life. Eddie sat in the living room of his daughter's apartment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on both of them. His daughter, Emily, sat across from him, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "I just don't understand, Dad," Emily finally said, her voice trembling. "You promised you were done with all of this. You swore you wouldn't gamble again. And now, after everything, you almost lost your life." Eddie looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. The guilt and shame gnawed at him, twisting his insides. He had failed her, just as he had failed so many others. His relapse had not only hurt him but had caused collateral damage to those he loved. "I know I messed up," Eddie admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I never wanted to hurt you, or anyone else. But I did, and I'm sorry." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to let him see her cry. "Sorry isn't enough, Dad. You keep saying it, but nothing changes. You keep putting us all through this, over and over again." Eddie felt a deep ache in his chest. He had been here before, in this same place, apologizing and making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But this time, it felt different. This time, the damage felt permanent. The impact of Eddie's choices rippled outwards, affecting everyone in his life. Emily wasn't the only one who had been hurt. His ex-wife, Sarah, had called him earlier that day, her voice a mix of frustration and concern. "Eddie, I don't know what to do anymore," she had said. "Emily's been so worried about you. She's had trouble sleeping, and she's been distracted at work. She doesn't need this stress in her life." Eddie had tried to explain, to apologize, but Sarah had cut him off. "I just want you to understand that your actions don't just affect you. They affect all of us. You need to get your life together, Eddie. For your sake, and for Emily's." The conversation had left Eddie feeling hollow, the realization of how deeply he had hurt those closest to him sinking in. He had always thought that his gambling was his problem, something he could handle on his own. But now he saw the truth. His choices had consequences that extended far beyond him. Eddie knew that his relationship with Emily was hanging by a thread. He had spent so many years trying to make amends for his past mistakes, but every time he thought he was making progress, something would happen to set him back. And now, after his most recent relapse, he feared that he might have finally pushed her too far. Emily had always been his anchor, the one person who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. But he could see that belief waning, replaced by a deep weariness. She had been through so much because of him, and he knew that there was only so much she could take. "Emily," Eddie said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know I've let you down, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily. But I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. For real this time. I'm going to get help, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make things right." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. "I want to believe you, Dad," she said, her voice soft. "But I'm scared. Scared that you'll say all the right things, and then go back to the same old patterns. I don't know if I can go through that again." Eddie nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I get it. I've given you every reason to doubt me. But I promise you, Emily, I'm going to do better. I can't change the past, but I can work on the future. I just hope you'll give me that chance." As the days passed, Eddie tried to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He attended support group meetings, sought therapy, and took steps to distance himself from the people and places that had fueled his addiction. It was a slow, painful process, but he knew it was necessary if he was going to have any hope of repairing the damage he had caused. Emily watched him cautiously, not yet ready to fully trust him, but also not willing to completely give up on him. She saw the effort he was putting in, the small changes he was making, and she wanted to believe that this time, things would be different. But the scars of the past ran deep, and Eddie knew that it would take more than words and promises to heal them. He had to prove, day by day, that he was truly committed to changing his life. And that meant facing the reality of what his choices had done, not just to him, but to everyone around him. Eddie's journey to redemption was far from over. The collateral damage of his addiction had left a trail of broken relationships and lost opportunities. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a determination to make things right. That he knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he could work towards a better future. And that future, he hoped, would include the people he loved, the people he had hurt, but who still held a place in his heart. As he sat in his small apartment, surrounded by the reminders of his past mistakes, Eddie made a vow to himself, to stay the course, to keep fighting, and to never let himself slip back into the darkness. It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Eddie stood at a literal crossroads, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows on the deserted intersection. In one direction lay the path that had nearly destroyed him, a path filled with the lure of easy money, the adrenaline rush of high-stakes gambling, and the false promises of quick fixes. In the other direction lay an uncertain future, one that demanded hard work, sacrifice, and the constant battle against his inner demons. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The weight of the decision bore down on him, the temptation to return to the only life he had ever known pulling at him with relentless force. But there was also the faintest glimmer of hope, a small voice in the back of his mind urging him to choose a different path, to finally break free from the chains of his addiction and find true redemption. Eddie knew this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. As he stood there, memories of his recent slip back into gambling flashed through his mind, the thrill of the bets, the intoxicating feeling of being on the edge, and the crushing despair that followed his inevitable losses. The last bet, the one that had nearly cost him everything, still haunted him. Yet, there was a part of him that longed for that rush, the excitement that had once made him feel alive in ways nothing else could. He thought about the debt collector's offer, a dangerous proposition that could either wipe his slate clean or pull him deeper into the abyss. It was a seductive offer, one that promised to solve all his problems with one last roll of the dice. But Eddie knew better. He knew that the odds were always stacked against him, and that every time he gambled, he was betting not just money, but his life, his relationships, and his future. But the temptation was powerful, the allure of the familiar almost overwhelming. For a moment, Eddie wondered if it would be easier to just give in, to let the darkness swallow him whole. He could escape the pain, the guilt, the endless struggle, at least for a while. Then, as if in response to his darkest thoughts, Eddie remembered the people who had stood by him through the worst of times. He thought of Emily, her voice trembling with fear and disappointment as she begged him to change. He thought of the former gambler who had extended a hand when he was at his lowest, offering him a way out, a chance to rebuild his life. He remembered the progress he had made, the small victories that had once seemed impossible. He recalled the moment when he had finally felt like he was on the right track, when he had begun to believe that he could be a better man. Redemption was within his reach, but it required him to turn away from the path that had led to his ruin. It meant confronting his demons head-on, accepting that there would be no quick fixes, no easy way out. It meant choosing to live, day by day, with the consequences of his past, while striving to build a future that was worth living. Eddie took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he stood there, torn between two worlds. He closed his eyes, trying to quiet the noise in his head, to listen to that small, insistent voice telling him that it wasn't too late to change. He could see both paths clearly, the one that led back to the darkness, and the one that offered a glimmer of light. As the minutes ticked by, Eddie realized that the decision wasn't just about him. It was about the people who cared about him, the people he had hurt and disappointed. It was about Emily, who still believed that he could be the father she needed. It was about the life he wanted to lead, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. With one final, decisive breath, Eddie opened his eyes and turned away from the darkness. The path to redemption would be hard, and it would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Eddie felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. He was choosing life, choosing to fight for a better future. He started walking, each step taking him farther from the temptation of ruin and closer to the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't be easy, but Eddie knew that he had made the right choice. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, determined to prove that he could change, that he could be the man he wanted to be. As he moved forward, Eddie felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift, replaced by a new sense of resolve. The road to redemption would be long, but it was a road he was finally ready to walk. Eddie sat alone in his small apartment, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city waking up. It had been a week since he made his choice, a choice to walk away from the path of ruin and commit to a life of redemption. But the consequences of his actions still loomed large, the damage he had caused lingering in every corner of his life. The first few days had been the hardest. The urge to gamble, to return to the familiar chaos, had been almost unbearable. But Eddie had resisted, holding on to the memory of that fateful decision at the crossroads. He knew that if he gave in now, all the progress he had made would be lost, and he'd be dragged back into the darkness he was trying so desperately to escape. But resisting the urge was only part of the battle. The real challenge lay in facing the aftermath of his choices, the people he had hurt, the relationships he had damaged, and the life he had nearly thrown away. Eddie knew that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. The fallout from his actions had left scars on those closest to him, and he would have to work hard to rebuild their trust. He started with Emily, knowing that their relationship was the most fragile. He called her, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Emily, I know I've let you down more times than I can count. But I'm really trying this time. I want to make things right." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Emily responded. "Dad, I want to believe you. I really do. But I need to see it. I need to know that you're serious about changing." Eddie nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove it to you. I'm starting therapy again, and I'm going to my support group every day. I hope you'll give me a chance." Emily's voice softened, a hint of the old warmth returning. "I want to give you that chance, Dad. But it's going to take time. We've been through so much. I need to see that this time is different." Eddie agreed, knowing that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. He promised to be patient, to take things one step at a time. It wasn't just about words anymore, it was about actions, about showing Emily that he was truly committed to change. Eddie also knew that he had to confront the ghosts of his past. There were old debts to settle, both financial and emotional, and people who deserved apologies that were long overdue. One of the most difficult confrontations came with his ex-wife, Sarah. He visited her, knowing that their history was fraught with pain and broken promises. She greeted him at the door, her expression guarded, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Eddie," she said, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," Eddie replied, his voice steady. "For everything I put you through, and for how I hurt you and Emily. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm trying to make things right. I just wanted you to know that." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if searching for signs of sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate that, Eddie. But you need to focus on the future, on being the father Emily needs now. I hope, for her sake, that you're serious about this." Eddie promised that he was, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of closure. He had faced his past, owned up to his mistakes, and now it was time to move forward. The days turned into weeks, and Eddie found himself slowly adjusting to his new life. It wasn't easy, Every day was a battle, and the temptation to fall back into old habits was never far away. But he stayed committed, attending therapy sessions, leaning on his support group, and finding solace in the small victories. One of the biggest changes came when Eddie started volunteering at a local addiction recovery center. Helping others who were struggling with the same demons he had faced gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. He shared his story, hoping that his experiences might serve as a cautionary tale for others. As time passed, Eddie noticed small but significant changes in his life. He was no longer consumed by the need to gamble, and the anxiety that had once been his constant companion began to fade. He reconnected with old friends, mended strained relationships, and found new ways to fill the void that gambling had once occupied. Most importantly, his relationship with Emily began to heal. She saw the effort he was making, the real changes in his behavior, and slowly started to trust him again. They spent more time together, rebuilding the bond that had been fractured by years of broken promises. The aftermath of Eddie's actions had been painful, but it also provided him with an opportunity, a chance to start over, to rebuild his life from the ground up. He knew that the path forward wouldn't be without challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the knowledge that he had the strength to change. Eddie's journey was far from over, but he was no longer the man he had once been. The choices he had made had brought him to the brink of ruin, but they had also led him to a place of redemption. He was determined to continue on this path, to live a life that he could be proud of, and to make amends for the mistakes of his past. As he looked out the window of his apartment, watching the city come to life, Eddie felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he was facing it with hope and a renewed sense of purpose. The aftermath of his actions had been a harsh teacher, but it had also given him the chance to rebuild, to create a new life, one that was worth living. Eddie found himself once again at a crossroads, but this time, it wasn't a place of despair or indecision. It was a place of hope, where the roads before him led to possibilities he had never truly considered until now. The journey to get here had been long and painful, marked by missteps and hard-won victories. But now, standing on the threshold of a new chapter in his life, Eddie felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose that he reflected on how far he had come. The Eddie who had once been consumed by his addiction, who had lost everything in a desperate bid to win back what was never really his, seemed like a distant memory. The man he had become was different, wiser, stronger, and more determined to create a life that wasn't defined by his past mistakes. The opportunity for change had come in the form of an unexpected job offer. One of the counselors at the Addiction Recovery Center, impressed by Eddie's commitment and the way he had helped others in their recovery, had suggested he consider becoming a peer mentor. The idea had taken Eddie by surprise, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Helping others navigate the same treacherous path he had once walked was something that gave him a sense of fulfillment. It was a way to give back, to make amends for the harm he had caused, and to ensure that his struggles hadn't been in vain. The offer to become a peer mentor was more than just a job, it was a new beginning, a chance to build a future that was meaningful and impactful. After a few days of contemplation, Eddie made his decision. He accepted the offer, knowing that it would be a challenge but also an opportunity to continue his journey of redemption. This new direction felt right, like the culmination of everything he had been through, and he was ready to embrace it fully. With his new role came the chance to rebuild his relationships with those he had hurt, particularly with Emily. The process had been slow, but every day brought them closer together. They spent more time together, talking about things they had never discussed before. Eddie shared his hopes and fears with her, and in return, Emily began to open up, slowly letting him back into her life. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Emily turned to Eddie with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I can see how hard you're working to change, and it means a lot to me." Eddie felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Emily. That means more to me than you know. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying every day to be better, for you, and for myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past beginning to lift as they looked toward the future. Eddie knew that their relationship would continue to have its ups and downs, but he was determined to keep moving forward, to be the father she needed and deserved. As the weeks turned into months, Eddie settled into his new role as a peer mentor. He found a deep sense of satisfaction in helping others, using his own experiences to guide them through their struggles. He was no longer running from his past. Instead, he was using it as a tool to create positive change in the lives of others. Eddie also began to take better care of himself, focusing on his health and well-being. He started exercising regularly, eating better, and finding new hobbies that didn't involve the high-stakes thrill of gambling. He discovered a passion for cooking, finding joy in preparing meals for himself and sharing them with friends and family. His relationship with Sarah, his ex-wife, also began to improve. While they were not the same as they had once been, they found a way to coexist peacefully, bound by their shared love for Emily. They both wanted the best for their daughter, and that common ground allowed them to put aside their differences and focus on being supportive co-parents. Eddie's life was far from perfect, but it was his, and he was proud of the man he was becoming. The path he had chosen was not without challenges, but it was a path that led to growth, healing, and a sense of purpose that he had never known before. One day, as he walked through the neighborhood he had once known so well, Eddie felt a profound sense of peace. The shadows of his past no longer haunted him, they were simply part of his story, a reminder of where he had been and how far he had come. At the end of the day, Eddie knew that life would continue to present him with choices, with moments where he would stand at a crossroads and have to decide which direction to take. But now, he was confident in his ability to choose the path that led to a better future, one where he could be proud of the life he was living. As he looked up at the sky, the sun setting in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Eddie smiled. This was his new beginning, a chance to live a life that was truly worth living, filled with love, purpose, and the knowledge that he had finally found his way.